Abstraction and Simulation, which are terms which will help you understand some of the kinds of things you're able to do in the classroom. I'm going to be looking at a lot of other ways of looking what happens in the second language classroom, but the main focus here is abstraction and simulation. So let's just have a quick overview of what we can expect here. I'm going to start by looking at what I'm going to call a folk language teaching situation. That's the situation where you start off teaching. You're in a situation you have to teach language, teach a second language. You've never done it before, and what you reach for are the kinds of things that you have learned and been exposed to during your schooling, and that's what you draw on. That's what I'm calling a folk language teaching perspective. Then I'll introduce the terms abstraction and simulation, and then I'm going to look at three approaches to understanding methods. Our first one is the classic Richards and Rogers paper, and that's available for you to read. Second one is by Kumaravadivelu, a classic paper on post-method pedagogy. We're going to read one of his papers later on, but it's not in this particular reading requirement for this lecture. And the third one is Alan Waters' kind of satirical view of methods, what he calls methodologia. Okay, and then we'll see if we can apply this notion of abstraction and simulation to grammar-based methodologies, and also to the notion of focus on forms and focus on form. Notice those terms are almost exactly the same, but one has got an S on the end. And it's kind of confusing, but they're two quite distinct approaches to the teaching of grammar and meaning. And we'll look at those two. And then finally, I'll see if you can develop some kind of framework for evaluating methodological choices, because that's what it's all about. Expanding your choices, expanding your palette so that you can choose particular methodologies to fit particular situations. Okay, one of my favorite shows is Homeland, and in one of the episodes of Homeland, season 1, episode 9, this was Crossfire. This is where Brody, who is a Marine who's been captured by a terrorist group, and he is being given the task of teaching the son of the main terrorist, Abu Nidal. His son's called Issa, and so he's given the task of teaching him English. Of course, he's never taught English before. He doesn't know how to do it. So what he starts off with is the particular things like ostension. Can you point to something and give it a name? Ostension means showing something. And that's a basis of techniques like total physical response, TPR, and the natural approach. And we'll learn more about those approaches later. He also picks out a piece of American culture. It's salient in the sense that it's an important piece of culture, and that is the ball game song. So he actually gets Issa to memorize and recite "Take Me Out to the Ballroom," to the ball game. And you probably remember this kind of aspect of language learning, a lot of memorization, learning off by heart, some kind of poem, and often in a foreign language. And that often is a basis of technique in what we'll call grammar translation method, or grammar translation. Okay, so let's get down to the notions of abstraction then. So abstraction is the process of taking away or removing characteristics or distracting details from complex contexts in order to reduce them to a set of essential characteristics that can be applied to multiple contexts. And what I've given you is a visual representation of the notion of abstraction, how we get from a real world picture of what looks like to be a pheasant, is it? And then we get to 5, a road sign, which tells you there's pheasants maybe crossing the road. That's the notion of abstraction. If we go to well, we don't go, if we look at a couple of things, the advantages and the disadvantages of abstraction, what we know is abstraction illuminates reality. And I've just taken a couple of pictures in this slide and the next slide to illustrate this. This is a particular a photograph, a diagram of a particular, what's it called, mitochondrion. And as you can see from the picture on the left, you can't see very much. That's an actual real photograph. But the actual abstraction, the model on the right, shows you the particular contours and dimensions. And so that picture on the right is an abstraction, but it allows you to understand how this particular phenomena works. So in that sense, abstraction is very positive because it illuminates reality. It tells you something more about reality which you can't see from the reality itself. Okay, but at the same time, abstraction can distort reality. So now on the left we have an abstract representation of the the human heart, and then on the right we have an actual photograph of the human heart. Well, clearly what we see when we look at the photograph is that in reality is not as simple and as flat as you can see in the abstraction on the left. Okay, so the anatomical textbook, the abstraction in it, gives the misleading impression that everything in the chest is immediately distinguishable. Well, sorry, once you open up the heart, you find it very complex, as you can see from the photograph. So the notion here is abstraction can illuminate reality, but at the same time it can distort it. So if we use this term with language teaching, we can look at its pluses and minuses. So one of the things that often happens in beginning teaching is that we have an overuse of the present continuous. So if you look at the picture, the classic approach is, what is the boy doing? He's sitting on the ground. He's got his hands over his eyes. Maybe he's crying. What we know is that the present continuous, the ing tense, is not used not nearly as much as the present simple. So in a sense, we're distorting the actual frequency occurrence of that tense, and it tends to be a classic reaction that students go on to overuse it. Let's look at the positive side now, where abstraction illuminates reality. If you do a corpus linguistics analysis, that is, if you look at vast corpora of English text, you'll find that in terms of the grammatical construction of the reflexive, you'll find that it appears more often with these verbs: find, see, show. I find myself, I saw myself, he saw himself. Present, manifest, consider. I consider myself to be a reasonable guy. Okay? Those are the most frequently occurring verbs in the reflexive form. But are you going to teach that? I don't think so, because those are pretty abstract terms. You're probably going to teach more concrete terms like cut and hurt. So if you look at the boy there, we could describe, say, well, he's hurt himself. That's why he's crying. So when we're thinking of language, we always naturally abstract away from the vast complexity of language. We have to. But at the same time, we have to do it in a way where we're illuminating the reality of the use of language and not distorting it. Okay, so now let's have a look at simulation. And here's the definition of simulation: the act of imitating the behavior of some situation or some process by means of something suitably analogous. And I just want to make a point here. There is another meaning of simulation, and that is in role play, where students take on particular types of roles in an extended type of role play situation. Here I'm just looking at the way that in the classroom we attempt to have kinds of language practice which mimic or simulate real world interaction. And of course, one of the key our techniques we use is the notion of role play, pair work, group work, what we call information and opinion gaps, where students have different information they have to share, or they have different opinions they have to share, or even in discussions. So these are classic ways we try to simulate the kind of real-world interaction which we do every day. Let's go forward. Okay, so if we take these two terms, abstraction and simulation, we notice that there's going to be degrees of abstraction and there's going to be degrees of simulation. If you look at some particular approaches to language teaching, approaches like content-based instruction, which focuses on teaching content knowledge in the same way that you take a content class, and another particular approach, which is called service learning, where you put students in particular situations where they're contributing to the community. So OPI has had a very successful service learning program where it sent students out to old people's homes, nursing homes, to the ATCO workshop for disabled workers, and into the schools. And the idea is the students are doing something, they're contributing to the particular local community, and that is the way that they are simulating. Well, actually, they're not simulating, because in this sense, there's no simulation. It's a pretty dynamic way of getting language practice. Apart from those two particular approaches, what we have to think of is what's the pedagogical value of abstraction or simulation. Okay, so let's go now and have a look at a couple of approaches to evaluating methodological choices. And this is the classic paper by Richards and Rogers. And what they do is break down the particular language methodologies into the notion of approach, design, and procedure. So, and you can read this paper and comment on it. But basically, the notion is that in approach, the questions that are asked are, what is the theory of language on which that particular approach is based? Is it structuralist? Is it communicative? And what is the theory of language learning? Okay, is it behaviorist? Is it cognitive? Is it constructivist? Next part is the notion of design. And so here we look at questions like the syllabus. What is the syllabus? How is it constructed? What's the role of the learner? What's the role of the teacher? And what's the role of the instructional materials? And then we get down to the kind of the mechanics of how this plays out in a particular language classroom situation. So this is the actual moment-to-moment techniques, practices, and activities. The second approach I want to look at here to describing language methodology is this very important paper by Kumaravadivelu. And we'll get to read this later on, but just to kind of summarize Kumaravadivelu's approach, it's a post-method approach. Richards and Rogers' framework has been understood as being very successful in describing methods, or what are often been known as designer methods. But if you go beyond those particular clear-cut methods, then that particular framework ceases to exist. Those particular methods are very teacher-centered, and methods, in a sense, can be described as being methods which are imposed upon students. What Kumaravadivelu is trying to get at is going beyond these kinds of methods and finding particular techniques, particular strategies, as he calls them, that can be considered to work in many different situations. And then the construction of method is choosing the particular strategies that fit in particular local situations. So in this sense, it's a very context-sensitive, location-specific based approach. Okay, and it takes into consideration both linguistic, sociocultural, and political particularities, the particular needs of a particular group of students in a particular place. Kumaravadi-Velo makes a very big claim because he's claiming that his macro strategies that he describes are based on current theoretical and empirical and pedagogical insights. Notice the word current, and he goes a step further to say that they are theory neutral. Let me read his quote there. A macro strategy is a broad guideline based on which teachers can generate their own situation-specific, need-based micro strategies or classroom techniques. Macro strategies are theory neutral as well as method neutral. I don't know. I don't get that. I don't see as any particular strategy can be theory neutral and certainly not method neutral. What we know is that the kinds of methods that we use are very much determined by political choices. And as those methods change, they change because the political situation, in a sense, changes. But what's interesting about Kumaravadi-Velo is that he has these broad macro strategies, and then he encourages teachers to be able to pick and choose between them for particular situations. And it may be that you don't choose the communicative approach, and that is the general paradigm in which we're working under in language teaching. You may not choose communicative language teaching. You might choose something else because it fits with the particular needs of a particular local situation and those particular students. Finally, here's Warder's view of methodology, and it's kind of a satirical view. And what basically, and read the paper, he is presenting here is a view of methods which basically is reflecting groups of specific interests. And we know that in academia, we know in any particular way of looking at the world, of acting in the world, there are interest groups that have their own particular way of looking at the world and of promoting that particular view. So he's given you a map. He's fantasized it as a map in which you can travel this island and you can travel from these particular areas. So the names on the right are kind of made up. They're a play on word. Methodsville would be the place where people who believe in methods still hang out. And then if you look at 4, Slaya, which is a play on words of second language acquisition, and then Fofia, focus on form, versus Fofsia, focus on forms. And remember, we talked about that a little bit earlier. And various other key areas. So he's trying to describe the particular political landscape, in a sense, where you have particular groups who hold to particular ideas. And that, in a sense, contradicts a lot of the kind of approach of Kumaravadi-Velo and his claim that you can have these theory-neutral strategies. Okay, let's see if we can apply some of this notion of abstraction and simulation to some particular approaches. This is an example of a very old text from the 1930s, incredibly successful, this particular text by Eckersley. And if you have a look at this, it comes up with some pretty amazing dialogue. Look at the one at the bottom there. Is that a man and a boy? No, it's not. It's a cat and a dog. I mean, can't you see that? There's something wrong with your eyes. Of course, Eckersley's not interested in the communicative value of this. He's trying to illustrate the particular way that we use negatives in English in the present tense. And his particular approach is very painstaking, and it was very successful for many, many years. And in fact, perhaps somewhere in the world you'll find that there are these texts are still being used. Um, okay, so there's more of the same. This is a listening, and as you can see, this is an incredible abstraction, just as the grammar is abstracted. Now we have a focus on the forms of language, but it bears nothing to the real world. Okay? What's this? This is a boy. That boy is idle. He isn't a clever boy. What are these? These are boys. Those boys are idle. They aren't clever boys. Okay, I don't think it's the kind of stuff we really want to listen to as a piece of discourse, but it is because it's distorting the reality of what we do with language. But as an abstraction, it's working very closely on those grammatical forms. Just as a sidebar here, Eugene Ionesco, who the great Romanian playwright who wrote in French, he studied English using kinds of texts like Eckersley's, and the effect it had on him, of course, was for him to write these theater of the absurd, where he was kind of mimicking the kind of language you find in language teaching books. So you can have a look at that, and as you can see, it's very similar. It's not it's not real language. It's language on display, as we say. It's focusing on particular forms, and it has the effect in his plays of promoting the notion of the absurd. So here's Mrs. Smith. There, it's 9 o'clock. We've drunk the soup and eaten the fish and chips and the English salad. The children have drunk English water. We've eaten well this evening. That's because we live in the suburbs of London and because our name is Smith. Okay, so you can read the rest, but you get the idea of how the absurdity in the form of abstraction, how it can distort reality, and how it can be used by something like Ionesco to show something of the absurdity of life. If we look at another example of focus on forms, and focus on forms was something that was very, very popular in the 60s and 70s, and especially a group of textbooks called Strategies. And this, well, this isn't from Strategies, but it was about that particular time. And this is a collection of songs. These songs were written specifically for language learning. And here's an example of present continuous baby. And maybe you can't get that link to work through the QuickTime movie, but you can have a listen to that. Anyway, here's an example of the lyrics. I'm walking down a street, I'm waiting for a bus, I'm watching an old lady. Yeah, it's the progressive form again, right? We talked about the distortion of reality by overusing continuous forms. And here they all are. And so what we're doing is focusing on the forms of this particular tense. By the way, when I was teaching and using this material many, many years ago, I hated it because it wasn't, well, it wasn't, let's go back again. It wasn't what I identify with. It wasn't cool, all right? Mr. Mundy was no Sergeant Pepper. That's what I'm looking for there. But the students loved it. And so there's a dilemma, and one of the factors of language teaching is that if you as a language teacher identify with music, then it's very hard for you to identify with this kind of simulation, attempt at simulation. It is very successful though, students loved it. Have a listen to it. Okay, so now let's go on to focus on form. Notice there's no S here, and this was a reaction to focus on forms. And focus on form uses, in a sense, no abstraction because it focuses on authentic texts. So we're not abstracting in a sense, although you could say by the choice of a particular text is an abstraction. And Long is the person who's very much this particular approach is based upon. Ideal communicative activities, according to Long, are those tasks that allow for a focus on form within the negotiation of meaning. And there's a huge, great literature on the use of focus on forms in the classroom. And this one example here from Yilmaz is the way that we can use what are called dictaglosses, in which students work together to reconstruct a story they've listened to twice or even more. So the idea is you use a dictation, um, and it's not one of those dictations where they write, you say it slow enough so it can be written down. You say it at this particular speed, so students have to remember large chunks of it, and they get together. And through the process of negotiating with each other, they focus on the form to reproduce and reconstruct when they write down the particular story that's been read to them. Okay, so that gets us to what I'm going to give you a list here of some of the kinds of choices you have, some of the questions you can ask. And I'm building here now on what we've looked at here in terms of Richards and Rogers, of Kumaravadi-Velu, of Methodologia, and the notion of abstraction and simulation. So, what is the theory of language that you are embracing when you particularly teach? What's the theory of language learning? Think about it. If you're doing memorization, that is your particular theory of language learning. What is the role of the teacher? Is it a very teacher-centered particular classroom? What is the role of the learner? Is it more learner-centered? And then if we go on to some of the questions that Kumaravadi-Velu raised, what are the context-specific constraints? If you're teaching, say, in a particular classroom, maybe it's our secondary school in China. You may have very large classrooms, and you may have an approach to language learning which very much believes in rote memorization, and that's what students expect. And so what are the most appropriate macro strategies given that local situation? And what specific techniques are warranted by that particular context? And then we'll go on to another question, and this is generated by Methodologia. How does the particular adopted approach relate to existing possible approaches? Think of the map of Methodologia. You may be operating in one of those particular areas. Hey, how about going for a walk around the island and visiting some of those other places? Do you have to maintain one little position on that island? And finally, the terms I've introduced here, what linguistic abstraction is being made and what simulation of communicative behavior is made. So what are you abstracting from the vast sea and reality of language? Because you have to abstract. And how are you simulating the kinds of interactive activities that go on in the real world? If you think of abstraction, we're doing it all the time. So in one sense, the actual variety of English that we teach in the classroom, and there are different varieties, and that in itself is a choice. So EIL refers to English as an international language, ELF, English as a lingua franca. Are there different world Englishes? There's American English, there's Canadian English, there's Australian English, there's British English, there's Indian English. When you go into a classroom, you often choose different genre based upon specific needs. So you may be abstracting away from the large area of language to teach, say, business or academic or travel or casual language. And you may abstract away from the need to work in different modes. Maybe your focus is on spoken or written, or maybe it's multimodal. And you may be looking at particular skills, speaking, reading, writing, and listening, and now that can be an abstraction. And then, of course, if you're pulling out and focusing on particular grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, that's another abstraction. Okay, so a lot to think about, a lot of choices. And the idea about language teaching in a second language situation is to be aware of the many, many, many different choices and options you have, and to be open to using and trying them out in particular situations.